Let me say first that it is both a great honor and a great pleasure to have Van Jones with us. Van and I got to know each other at CNN when we were doing Crossfire together, and he is such a remarkable leader in so many areas, and somebody who is so thoughtful that I'm just really honored that he's here. We've done a lot of work together on criminal justice reform. We found, I think, a little to our surprise, that we have a lot more things we want to get done together than things we want to fight over.
Yep.
And so we were going to get together today to talk with you, and a future Facebook Live will be on opioid recovery and some things that really affect human beings in a way that Van is deeply concerned about. But with the events in the last few days in Minneapolis and Baton Rouge and in Dallas, we just felt that we should talk about the larger question of how do we bring Americans together again, and recognize that there's a lot of profound reason to worry about the way in which we are becoming alienated from each other, and that we've got to rethink what it means to be American and how we function together as an extended family. So I want to turn it over to Van and let him start this, but it's a topic he is passionate about and has spent much of his life on. So,
well, as have you, and it is a huge honor to be here. I got a chance to work with Newt on CNN. We did Crossfire together, and it turned out that there are issues that the right and left agree on, and frankly, strong conservatives and strong liberals agree on passionately, including the idea that our criminal justice system could be incredibly improved. But I think there's a gut test for everybody, and I don't think anybody in the country can pass this test, which is why we've got to come back together. If you cried tears yesterday when that young man was bleeding out in the car, but you did not cry tears today after those cops died, that is a big signal that we are moving apart, that we're losing sense, not just of common citizenship, but common humanity. Similarly, if you cry today and were outraged by the cops falling, those heroes who were shot down by a racially motivated, bigoted terrorist, but you had a little bit of closed heart towards some of these black videos, that's also a signal. When you're one country and you're one people, you cry at every funeral. You may have a difference of understanding, but deep down inside you say, geez, do we have to have so many funerals in the country? My big hope as we go forward is that we all check ourselves and come back together and say, hold on a second. You could, and you know more history than I do, but you could wind up in a situation where you start getting so unbalanced that you actually see your fellow citizens as not just an enemy and an other, but not even a human being you have any empathy for. And once you're in that situation, that is hard to uncurdle that milk. And I think advocates on both sides, I think, today need to do a gut check. Do you not have the ability to understand the fear and the pain of both sides? If you do, great, talk a lot more. If you don't, pray a lot more.
I think that's a good injunction, a good starting point for this conversation. I was really struck on both counts. I mean, first of all, something which you know and which you have to worry about with your own children is that it is more dangerous to be black in America. It's both more dangerous because of crime, and which is the Chicago story, but it is more dangerous in that they're substantially more likely to end up in a situation where the police don't respect you and where you could easily get killed. And I think sometimes for whites it's difficult to appreciate how real that is. I mean, how it's an everyday danger. At the same time, the police, many of whom now are black, I mean, we have moved towards a much more integrated society. I think there's a black police chief in Dallas, for example.
Absolutely.
There was a black police chief in Baltimore. I think there's a black police chief in Chicago. And yet, in some ways, the black police are as alienated from the community as white police, and have the same sense of threat. I mean, that every time you walk up to a car, you could be killed. Every time you go into a building where a robbery's in progress, you could be killed. So the police actually lead lives that are as much on the front line of saving civilization as our military, but we don't quite have the same sense of awe and same respect, and yet they put their life on the line every day.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, because you've seen this from the left, but I've watched you, and I mean, you really see a lot more than just a traditional person on the left. What do you think? I mean, if you could wave a magic wand and you were president tomorrow morning, what are the first 3 or 4 things you would do as an American?
Well, first of all, as we've talked about many times, my dad was a cop in the military. And I think that's a big, I grew up in the rural South. I grew up in a small town. I went to public schools, church pretty much every Sunday. Not every Sunday, but almost every Sunday. My dad was a cop in the military, got out, became an educator. My mother was also an educator. So I tend to see things a little bit differently than some of my coastal elite liberal friends. We just had a different upbringing. I was taught to be not just respectful, but beyond respectful to law enforcement, just because of the threat, but also the good. It wasn't just the fear of the bad, but it was also the respect of the good that I was raised with. First thing I would do is, we always wind up on the very back end. There's some police officer who made a choice. You might agree with it, I may disagree with it, or vice versa. But we say we want that officer on the very back end of the process, disciplined, demoted, fired, prosecuted. Nobody's looking at the front end. We worry about who you're going to fire. We never talk about who you're going to hire. The very first thing we should do is to start doing a better screening process on the front end. Sociopathic behavior should be aggressively tested for. 7% of all people are sociopaths. They just are. But some people say a larger percentage of those people may be applying for badges. Are we checking for that? Every little tiny law enforcement agency should be checking for that. Checking for bias. It's hard if you hire people and you don't know if they're sociopaths and you don't know if they're biased, and then you try to dump training on top of that, you're already behind. I don't think anybody would disagree with better screening on the front end to make sure that we're only getting the best. Then you put the training, and then you put the accountability, and you probably are going to eliminate a big chunk of the problem. If you focus less on the firing and more on the hiring, I think you get more unity. I haven't heard that talked about. The other thing I think is important is, I think that the black kids and the cops actually have more in common. Because what you just said, they both feel alienated. They both feel that nobody understands them. They both feel like they got targets on their back. That should be a reason to come together. It's like, only you can understand me. I mean, that actually could be a framework. How are we alike? What does it feel like? I can't take my skin off, and you walking down the street can't take your badge off. How does that make us alike? Nobody is pointing to the fact that you have 2 groups in the country that actually are having a similar experience and may actually, at the end of the day, have more solidarity because of it. Dylan Roof went in and shot a whole bunch of black people. Deranged, racial bigot terrorist shot a whole bunch of black people at that church in South Carolina. A deranged bigot terrorist just shot up a whole bunch of cops in Dallas. You're both dealing with a possibility of some deranged bigot grabbing a gun. What does that mean that we should have in common? Nobody's trying to bring us together. You get points when you keep us apart.
It's a really interesting concept that in fact, all the advantages in the media are to describe the gap and the hostility and the tension, when in fact what the communities ought to be trying to figure out is, how do we actually talk through, what would the world be like if everybody who was a Black Lives Matter activist could have that world? And in that world, what would their relationship with the police be like, if that makes sense? Now, we're going to get a number of questions, I know, and we'll start with Connor Hewitt, who wrote in and said, with all Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter groups now clashing over their beliefs, where do we need to go next as a country to move forward? Is there really that big a difference between all lives matter and Black Lives Matter in your mind? I mean, is there a rejection of the reality of race when somebody says, well, I'm for all lives matter and I don't like Black Lives Matter? Or how do you, when you see it, how do you react?
Yeah, it does land poorly, because it seems like you're trying to dismiss the point. The human mind is funny, and we've talked about this a lot. Let me just say some stuff that you don't expect me to say. Most black people are killed not by cops. Most black people are killed by other black people. Okay? That's a fact. That's not some But if the only time you point that out is when there's been a cop shooting, but you don't point that out any other time, it seems opportunistic. If you, and you and I have talked about this, if you care every day about the number of funerals in the black community, you got more standing to point this out. I can say that, nobody's going to get mad at me. But I think sometimes people will use that. They'll say, well, you guys kill each other, why do you care about the cops? Well, hold on a second, I'm going to go to every funeral, I'm going to cry at every one. Don't tell me which funeral I have to cry at. I cry at all of them. But I think if you say all lives matter, it shows that there's a misunderstanding. It shows, I think, that you're hearing the person saying Black Lives Matter more than everybody else's lives. If they were smart, it would have been Black Lives Matter too. That's really what they mean. They mean Black Lives Matter too. But it sounds like they're saying Black Lives Matter and white lives don't, or Black Lives Matter more than blue lives. And then you have this conflict. So I think that this battle of the hashtags comes out of the fact that we don't sit down and talk anymore. All of these conflicts are mediated over platforms that reward conflict. TV, our show wasn't called Ceasefire, it was called Crossfire. Twitter should be called Hater half the time, because the hotter it gets, the more the retweets. So I think that we got to come up with some new hashtags to bring us together. I don't know what they could be, but we got to come up with something.
Well, but I think it also, and it took me a long time, and a number of people talking to me over the years to begin to get a sense of this. If you are a normal white American, the truth is you don't understand being black in America, and you instinctively underestimate the level of discrimination and the level of additional risk in a way that you have to have a corrective. But the minute you start getting the corrective, so Black Lives Matter in a sense, and I like your point, Black Lives Matter too, would in fact try to be a corrective which initially people reject because it's not in their world. So to the degree that if you're an African American, you are raising your teenage boys to be very careful in obeying the police because they're literally, their lives are at risk, and they can see it on television. At the same time, if you are a normal Caucasian, you don't see that. That's not part of your experience. And somehow we have to be able to have a conversation and a dialogue where the mutual experiences start getting us to say, gee, if that's true, under what circumstance can we fix it on both sides?
Right. Right.
I mean, does that make any sense?
No, it really does. And I think, it's also people, I was just thinking when you're talking about the vast majority of Americans are killed by other Americans, right? 0.001% killed by Muslim terrorists or whatever. But when that happens, it's a big offense. The vast majority of black Americans killed by black Americans. But if a police officer, black or white, does it, it rings a certain bell. It's the lack of understanding across these lines, I think, is a fixable thing. I really look, if you and I can work together as well as we do, I mean, Lord knows, there are very few things we agree on. But the things we agree on, we have a different politics of the head. We have the same politics of the heart. We really want ordinary people to have a better experience in this country.
Right.
So my basic belief about where we are right now is that both sides now, and now you can say both sides, I think you have two grieving camps in the country this weekend. You're going to have funerals starting next week, and you're going to be able to just track on Twitter and on TV who cares about who. The leadership is going to come from the people who say we care about both and can demonstrate that. What you just said about the African American experience, I think is really powerful. That you understand that there is a difference. Now, somebody could abuse that and say, yeah, that's why I don't have this, and that's why I don't have that. No. You still have to work hard, and you still have to obey the rules. We can have that conversation now because you've at least acknowledged that there's something there. When I come across, and I sometimes may, that I'm just putting all police officers in a category, and I'm not respecting my uncle, Milton Douglas Jones, who just retired from the Memphis City Police Department. I'm not honoring what he went through, what my dad went through, and I'm just pushing. What I'm doing is I'm absolutely creating what I say I don't want. I say I want respect, but I'm not showing it. I say I want to be seen as a human being, but I'm not demonstrating that. I say I want to be seen as a full person, and don't treat me bad because somebody else did. But I'm doing the exact thing I say I don't want. And I think the police sometimes are doing that as well. if we can start talking that way, I don't know what the policy change is, but there may be a temperature change.
Let me ask you along the line something that I have been puzzled by, and I have not been able to figure out the right way to deal with it. Chicago is a disaster at a human level for people, particularly in a handful of neighborhoods. I mean, large parts of Chicago are just fine, and those folks don't seem to get it. But there are neighborhoods that are war zones as bad as anything in the Middle East. And I think it was last weekend, they were averaging 2 shootings an hour. Now, what I'm fascinated by is, why does it not exist? If you think about it in the national conscience, this has been going on in Chicago for several years. And it doesn't, it doesn't exist for the president who's from Chicago, or the Senator Clinton who was born there. It doesn't exist for the Congress. It doesn't exist apparently for Springfield and the state government. It's just, oh gee, there's this zone where people happen to get killed. But it happens a lot. And yet we have no sense nationally that this is a problem we should be fixing.
I think it's a shame. I mean, I'm just be honest. I think there's a sense of shame, especially in the black community, that there are places that we don't know ourselves how to fix. And then it does come up, but mainly on the conservative shows. I think it does show up on the conservative shows, but it usually is people who there's no trusting relationship.
Right.
In other words, if you had someone who was there and who was putting the work in and who held the kids and whatever, went to the funerals, and that person came out, that Republican came out and said, somebody's got to do something, then there's a sense of trust. I think there's this double sense of shame and resentment. Shame that there are these families that are falling apart, these neighborhoods that are falling apart, and we don't know what to do. And how many dadgum vigils can we have, and teddy bears and candles lit, and then resentment that then these other people are coming around and saying, see, you guys suck, but you're not there to help me tomorrow. And I think you get in this cycle of shame and resentment, and guess what? The funerals keep happening, and nothing's going forward. And I don't think there's any excuse at all. I'm not making excuses. I'm just trying to give an explanation.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to. Well, and I remember when we were doing Crossfire, you were the one person who would come back again and again and say, look, can we do a ceasefire segment at the end? Can we find somebody to be positive? So, and I don't know if this is the old PBS requirement or what, but I'm wondering, is there a pattern by which we ought to be finding some venue that is a bringing us together, problem-solving venue, rather than a finger-pointing, ideological warfare venue?
Look, I'm going to tell you stuff I see as very positive signs of hope. As you know, Paul Ryan is somebody who there's very few people in American life I actually hate. Very few. Good Christian, work very hard at this. But Paul Ryan in 2012 was somebody I literally hated. I took his quote about makers and takers and I taped it to my laptop. And whenever I got tired, I would look at that quote and I would work harder. I felt like he was saying, if you are down on your luck, you're just a taker. If you're a wounded veteran, you're just a taker. If you're a single mom on getting some food stamps for your kids, you're a taker. I said, that guy should never be close to the White House. I've watched Paul Ryan since those days say he should have never said that, actually took it back, got zero credit from anybody, which is horrifically bad for liberals who say we want people to improve, and then when they do, we either ignore them or attack them more. And I've seen him then actually take real steps to talk about power. He wants to be the new Jack Kemp. I get that. That's good. Why aren't we running to him and saying, let's find one line in one amendment of one bill we can work on together? That's not what it is. Now it's like, oh, well, he's trying to steal our issue. He's doing some partisan thing to us. What if he helped someone? What about that? Okay, you can't have that conversation. So I see positive. I don't like Donald Trump at all. But he's pointing to things that I was marching around in Seattle in 2000 saying, I don't like these trade deals. The fact that there might be some criticism now about these trade deals shared across party lines, once the election's over, we should go back to that. There are things we actually could work on together. But the system rewards, I would never talk to Newt Gingrich. I would never talk to Van Jones. Am I wrong?
No, I'm laughing at the thought, though, that you're marching around here about these trade deals. Somebody says to you, Donald Trump agrees with you. You put down your placard and say, well, I need to go find a new issue, because if he agrees, I know I must have been wrong.
Exactly. I love NAFTA. It's like my favorite bill.
That's very funny. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Listen, we're going to run out of time today, unfortunately, because I know you got a hard stop. But I just want to propose we find some ways, and we also say this to all of our many friends on Facebook. We need to find a way to create a dialogue that doesn't back off. That's not just intermittent. I mean, we've had, when I was young, before you were born, as an Army brat who'd been born in Pennsylvania and who'd moved around to Europe and Germany and France, as well as living in Fort Riley, Kansas, I was largely in an integrated society by law, because the U.S. government had done it right after World War II. And when I arrived in Georgia in 1960, it was still legally segregated, which meant that the local sheriff and the National Guard and the government at large would impose by force taking away rights from Americans. And we've come a fair distance in that, as you know, we now have a black mayor of Atlanta, for example, and have had a series of them. We've had, we have John Lewis has gone from marching at Selma to being the Democratic whip in the U.S. Congress. I mean, a lot of things, we've made progress. But for some reason, we stalled out on the cultural, economic, practical progress we needed to parallel the fight over legality. And we're seeing that, and then what that creates is the kind of alienation where it begins to be legitimate to think about, whether it's in songs or it's in slogans or whatever, shooting policemen. And then the whole society is faced with a crisis, I think, of meltdown. If it really continue, if we were to continue in this direction of alienation on both sides, you could really be a pretty coarse and dangerous society in another 10 or 15 years. So what I'd like to do is come back and urge the folks who are watching us to feel free to send us their ideas, and maybe we can schedule another opportunity to have this kind of conversation even more depth and continue down this road.
Yeah. I would love to do that. And also, everybody has a friendship like this, whether you elevate it or not. You've got your ex-boyfriend or your cousin or your auntie or your uncle, somebody who sees the world very differently. That should become your most valuable relationship for the next 6 to 12 months. We've got to reach across and hang on. It's going to be a rough ride. The election's going to be tough. But if we can just reach across and hang on so there's at least some goodwill, whoever wins this election on the back end, the cleanup job, I think is going to be tremendous. And we're going to need each other. Bottom line, and my kids are going to need for the grown people to act right. I try to get the kids to stop fighting, and then they see me on TV fighting with the grown people, and they can't figure it out. So, let's stay together.
Good. Thank you all very much for watching today.